Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th Coastal Connections workshop. Our theme for today is Policy, Principles and Practice. I'm Dr. Alex Kent, and it's my privilege, as always, to lead the Coastal Connections project. If you don't already, this is a joint initiative between World Monuments Fund and English Heritage to build a global network for sharing knowledge, experience, and practical solutions amongst all those who manage or care for coastal heritage. So if you're joining us today from a coastal heritage site, or if you manage or care for one, you're really, really welcome. So headquartered in New York, World Monuments Fund is the leading independent organisation devoted to safeguarding the world's most treasured places, to enrich people's lives and to build mutual understanding across cultures and communities. There are affiliate offices in other countries, including the UK, where Coastal Connections is based, and WMF has been involved in over 800 heritage conservation projects since it was founded in 1965. So no surprise to you, you'll be noticing we'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary next year and 30th anniversary in the UK. English Heritage, based in England, it's a charity that cares for over 400 sites and their collections in England for the benefit of this and for future generations. Its work is informed by the values of authenticity, quality, imagination, responsibility, and fun. And its vision is that people will experience the story of England where it really happened. We always like to know where you're joining us from, so please feel free to say hello in the chat and say where, particularly if you manage a coastal heritage site. But even if you don't, you're especially welcome as well today, and obviously feel free to call out to say where you're from. So as usual, what we'll be doing is hearing from our speakers first. We've got 4 fantastic speakers lined up today, and then after a brief question and answer session, we'll discuss the topic in breakout rooms. We'll also incorporate a short Mentimeter survey today, where you can help us to identify topics for future Coastal Connections workshops. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say for that. And the good news is we're already planning to extend our programme. You might look at the sheet that we had at the beginning of this series and notice that it would run until this time, actually, until July. And actually, we're going to run throughout into the autumn or spring if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. So we'll start our next workshop in October. And so your input into deciding the themes for those next few workshops will be really, really useful. And we've been so thrilled to see the level of engagement and participation already that we have in this first series. So what I'm going to do now, before anything else, is hand over to Meredith Wiggins, my colleague in New York, Senior Director of Climate Adaptation at World Monuments Fund. And I'll tell you a little bit about Meredith. So as an archaeologist and environmental researcher who works at the nexus of climate and culture, Meredith joined WMF from the field of international development, where she spent 5 years designing and implementing climate mitigation and adaptation projects for the US government. Before that, Meredith spent 16 years in the UK, working for Historic England and English Heritage in research, urban planning, and in protection. So we're especially pleased to welcome Meredith with us today, and I will hand over to you, Meredith. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much for having me, Alex. It's very exciting, and I've already seen some familiar faces putting their names in the chat, so it's nice to see everyone out there. I was really interested in joining this conversation because as a global organization, World Monuments Fund supports disparate communities and diverse heritage in many different geographies. And it makes it really tricky, but incredibly important to talk about things like policy, which of course varies by country and by region. However, globally, coastal environments are often more alike than they are dissimilar, and heritage practitioners working in marine and coastal environments, like the experts that you'll be hearing from today, embody a growing body of practical knowledge on this topic. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start out with some basic facts and figures I found. An estimate of global coastline, of course, it's dynamic, but it's more than 600 kilometers. And within the near coastal zone, more than 2 billion people work, live, and transmit their cultural heritage. Now, it would be ideal if the third fact that I had for you would be to quantify the numbers of heritage asset at risk at the coast globally, but of course, this is very tricky, and I'll come back to that later. But I've got 2 small examples. Firstly, a 2018 study of World Heritage Sites quantified the numbers at risk due to flooding and sea level rise. And a 2017 study, next slide, please. A 2017 study quantified the loss of over 13,000 recorded archaeological sites and 1,000 locations that are currently eligible in America for national level protection. So I know it's too small to read by looking at the map there, but the red on the map is not the future, it's the present, and it's the cultural heritage that is at or below sea level rise right now. So we clearly can't save everything. How do we have those sensitive and inclusive conversations, as I know Cultural Connections is doing already, about how we encourage and discuss managed loss? Next slide, please. So coastal marine environments are naturally always changing. As I say, they're dynamic. They have multiple uses and meanings, from industry to tourism to fishing to spiritual significance and many, many others. And lastly, their governance and ownership is often shared between private hands, public trusts, and government agencies with different budgets, priorities, and incredibly importantly, different data sets. And you'll see there at the bottom, I included tax agencies in this, since coastal change around the world is increasingly transferring private land into land held by the government. It means a loss of tax revenue and increased management issues for the governments, but it also has potential increased conflict because there are going to be different ideas about what people do with heritage at the coast and marine assets. And when that differs, that creates conflict. Next slide, please. So there are many issues happening at the coast, from environmental threats and resultant risks to changing economic, political, and social conditions in many societies. Though coastal and marine heritage can be resilient, one risk is that some of it can be thought of as unknown or hidden, since many heritage assets are intangible or are underwater and require specific technologies to access them. Globally, the creation of coastal development policies that seek to exploit, utilize, or incorporate coastal and marine heritage assets should have much more oversight and participation from Indigenous groups, and I know we'll be talking about this later, local communities, and heritage experts. While blue carbon projects and initiatives to rewild coastlines can lead to increases in ecosystem services, they also risk marginalizing communities. Consideration of the desired outcomes created through these kinds of projects and whose resilience is actually being developed should be central to management and coastal and marine heritage. Next slide, please. So a lot of academic work and funding is going into creating new methodologies, models, and systems to understand vulnerability and to predict future change. This is just a couple of examples. But what I would say is not enough work is going in to incorporate the multiple ways of knowing into the scientific literature. And although the heritage field is strategically positioned to engage climate change and sea level rise science, we're rarely involved in climate discussion. A notable exception to this was the 2021 co-sponsored ICOMOS IPCC meeting on climate change and cultural heritage. Next slide, please. And I've put this link up there for you, for anyone to have a look. These are fantastic resources. Next slide, please. So this is just two of the different policies, but in terms of international policy, both the Venice Declaration and Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction support the integration of cultural heritage into local and national disaster risk reduction strategies. But I would argue that there are two major issues with implementing this, and these are my two kind of concluding thoughts. One is the state of good quality data varies considerably across the globe, and we'll be seeing how some of the people who are speaking today are helping to address that issue. There's widespread underinvestment into how climate change affects coastal hazards and their potential risks to heritage. The research literature tends to be restricted to localized case studies, and regional overviews are very rare, and this is a real problem. Another issue is that the multi-jurisdictional nature of the coast means that we're often working with colleagues with wildly different priorities and levels of technical knowledge. Translation of heritage concepts into practical decision-making tools for non-heritage stakeholders is therefore critical. And one good example of this just came out last week, I believe, from Ireland. Next slide, please. It's a bit difficult to see this, but it's a very simple document that goes through a number of types of heritage asset and then asks simple yes or no questions that help point non-specialists to actions that they can take or data sets that they can use to find out more information. So next slide, please. I just wanted to leave you with some final thoughts. For me, increasing the coverage of regional and global heritage data sets will allow us to integrate heritage considerations into existing monitoring and management frameworks. And translating what we do and what we care about more into accessible language for our partners will help non-specialists make better decisions regarding marine and coastal heritage. Implicit in both of these questions are two issues that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, engaging with the idea of loss, the idea that we can't save everything. And secondly, constructively melding Indigenous science and Western science for the benefit of ecosystems, heritage assets, and local communities. I know that these are just a few themes that will be touched on by some of our speakers today, and I'm looking forward to the discussions afterwards, and especially to hearing from all of you working across the globe to care for, promote, and increase the resilience of coastal and marine heritage. I'm passing back to you now, Alex.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Adema, for that fantastic and stimulating introduction. Really good to get us all thinking about some of these broad-ranging issues and how policy can inform practice and vice versa. So just to say what we'll do then for the next section of the whole workshop is obviously listen to the fantastic panel that we've got together to share their knowledge and expertise with us. What I would say, as usual, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat and then we'll address them at the end when all speakers have presented. But if something comes to your mind, just put it in the chat and then we'll address them at the end. So without further ado, let's get straight on to introducing our first speaker. So Anthony is head of Marine and Coastal Heritage, Historic England. We've already heard about Historic England today already. He's a background in marine archaeology and has been closely involved with marine and coastal heritage in a wide range of forms as a practitioner, project manager, consultant, and policy advisor. So we're really listening to what you have to say. And with that, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. So yes, good afternoon here. Hello, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I'm Anthony Perth. I'm head of Marine and Coastal Heritage at Historic England, and I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the scope of heritage policy for changing coasts, if you like, from my perspective. So next slide, please. So Historic England is the government statutory advisor on heritage in England, including heritage on our coastlines and since 2002 in our adjacent seas. We have duties set out in law to secure the preservation of ancient monuments and historic buildings, to promote public enjoyment and to advance public knowledge. So in relation to coastal change, these duties introduce a major challenge because preservation implies preventing or resisting change, but the forces we are facing are enormous. So the reference to so far is practicable here in that 33.1 is really important. And rather than preservation, we tend to talk about conservation. So managing change in a way that is sustainable. It's also worth noting that our responsibilities are framed primarily in terms of tangible heritage, so monuments, buildings, shipwrecks, places, but there's a recognition that tangible heritage is interwoven with intangible heritage, and increasingly a recognition of that interweaving with other forms of creativity and culture. That is to say, tangibles, intangibles, and creativity are mutually supportive. So our duties are combined in our advice and activities such that every action addresses, in effect, those three elements of our duties of physical conservation, public engagement, and advancing knowledge. And whilst the particular blend of these three elements will vary according to circumstances, they are always all present. So next slide, please. For heritage, coastal change is clearly a complex matter. What springs to mind most swiftly is environmental change at the coast, especially shoreline change causing heritage assets to fall into the sea or be destroyed by erosion. And although shoreline change is a major issue, we must also be mindful of the effects of extreme weather, so wave impacts, intense rainfall, and heat waves. So heat waves, even in the UK, are causing problems. Shoreline change and extreme weather have been impacting heritage assets for centuries, but hazards are becoming greater, more frequent, and more damaging as a result of climate change. And concern is heightened where heritage assets are at risk from environmental changes, but where no human action is anticipated. So heritage assets are on cliffs or foreshores, where the overall policy that's been taken towards shoreline changes is no active intervention, which is a little bit of jargon in the UK about not choosing to intervene to stop erosion or coastal shorelines from changing their form. And Historic England's addressing heritage at risk from environmental change at the coast as its resources allow, really. It's including providing advice on the heritage implications of plans, strategies, and proposals of many different hues. But the consequences of climate change for coastal heritage are not limited to environmental change. As well as the direct impacts of shoreline change and extreme weather, heritage is also implicated in our responses to these changes, often framed as mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Mitigation includes our efforts to decarbonize energy production, much of which is focused on marine renewables, such as offshore wind, new transmission infrastructure, carbon capture, and carbon sequestration, all of which have ramifications for coastal heritage. And adaptation includes our efforts to deal with coastal erosion and flooding, including through major engineering works and managed realignment of the shoreline. Heritage at the coast is at risk from both mitigation and adaptation if the presence and sensitivities of heritage sites have not been anticipated in optioneering and design. Equally, if heritage is left out of the mix, then heritage itself can present risks to the consenting, budgets, and timescales of projects which are themselves vital in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Resilience addresses how coastal communities become better at coping with coastal change through greater preparedness and changing public behaviours. And building resilience is an aspect of our collective response to climate change where I think heritage can really help, and that's something that we're exploring too. Climate change is also accompanied by a pressing need for nature recovery at the coast. Nature is highly depleted in its own terms. Climate change in the oceans is adding to stresses and changes in conditions and distributions. And nature in itself offers sustainable solutions for climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. So we're working increasingly closely with public bodies such as Natural England and the Environment Agency on a range of topics relating to nature recovery at the coast. Just listed some out there. I'm not going to go into the details of those at the moment. So nature recovery certainly adds to the complexities of change at the coast for heritage, creating challenges, but it's also presenting important opportunities for heritage to contribute to renaissance in that sphere of nature recovery too. Alongside environmental change, whether it's climate related or nature recovery related, we keep in mind the enormous social changes that occurred at the coast, whose continue to be felt. These economic and social changes have environmental drivers too, which are exacerbated by climate change, but their implications for heritage need to be recognised in their own right. Many coastal communities owe their origins, development, character to their relationship with the sea, and these relationships have undergone massive changes over the last century or so in fishing, shipbuilding, seafaring, transport, tourism, and so on. All have been a major source of activity, affluence, identity, and pride, shaping places and communities. But as they have ebbed, they've given rise to structural problems, including deep-seated inequalities in income, housing, education, health, well-being, and so on. So the heritage of those places often presents that have experienced major downturns, but heritage and the distinctive character it instills has significant potential to support regeneration. So undoubtedly, coastal places are facing major changes from environmental, economic, and social pressures. Sorry, should say to change slide. Heritage is affected directly by these changes, but also by our response to those changes, encompassing mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience, as well as the direct impacts of environmental change. And our approach to heritage and coastal change should include measures to address the inequalities and disparities faced by many coastal communities alongside climate crisis and nature recovery. But I'd like to emphasize that coastal heritage is not just a passive subject of negative impacts. It has an essential positive role to play as our relationship with the sea continues to evolve. So next slide, please. So I'm going to return now to those duties. In terms of physical conservation, for example, a more integrated approach could be taken to heritage assets that also serve as flood and coastal erosion defences, such as many historic seafronts. So here the flood defences are effectively a 15th century city wall. Similarly, the importance of heritage in placemaking could contribute more to maintaining local distinctiveness and character where engineering interventions are required. We don't need to have faceless concrete everywhere, distracting from the character of our coastal places. And there could be greater recognition of heritage as a source of economic and social value when developing cost-benefit analyses for projects to alleviate flooding and erosion. Next slide, please. In relation to advancing knowledge, heritage can offer evidence and insight on coastal change over long timescales, including where human interventions in centuries past may have contributed to current risks. And heritage may also be a source of management options, uncovering information about best practices and traditional knowledge embedded in the landscape itself, I think echoing Meredith's point there. Finally, last slide, next slide. On public engagement, heritage is a powerful means of drawing people into discussion about coastal change. It has great potential in building community resilience, providing settings to explore the relationship between people and changing coastal environments over time, and to develop adaptational narratives. And through citizen science, heritage offers opportunities for agency too, so that people can do something positive themselves to identify and record what is important to them about their coastal places. So last slide. So thank you for the opportunity to provide this brief presentation. I've sought to outline the scope of heritage policy in the face of widespread and complex changes to our coast. I hope you found it thought-provoking. Obviously, very happy to answer questions and discuss this in a later stage of the workshop. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony. Really fascinating overview there. And again, just a reminder, if you have a question, anyone that you want to put to any of our speakers, just put them in the chat and then we will look at them at the end as we go through listening to the speakers first of all. But thanks again, Anthony. Really, really interesting and nice to have the citizen science angle highlighted right at the end too. I know that many of the participants of the workshop will be deeply involved with all sorts of initiatives like that. So thank you very much indeed. Great. Right, let's move then straight to Professor Joanne Clark. And again, we're really glad to have Joanne with us today. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Joanne and a lot of the work that she's been doing. So if you don't know already, Joanne is a professor in the Sainsbury Research Institute for the Arts of Africa, Oceania and the Americas. Jo researches and teaches at the intersection of heritage and climate change, specifically the impacts of climate change on coastal heritage sites in Africa and globally. She is currently working with a team of international scholars modelling the impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion on global coastal heritage. She has co-authored many research articles and policy documents on archaeology, heritage and climate change. She was a contributing author to the IPCC's Assessment Report 6, Working Group 2, on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. A lead author for the United Nations Environment Programme's Global Environment Outlook. So we're really Jo. So please take it over. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alex. Just before I start, I just want to say that I couldn't have done this work without the team that I work with. A couple of them are actually in the audience tonight, this afternoon, and the maps are not mine. They are members of our team. So I just want to thank them for allowing me to use allowing me to share our data with you. So the two questions that accompany this workshop are whether we speakers have challenged thinking on approaches to conserving coastal heritage, or whether you could implement any of our approaches. And I want to come at these two questions from a slightly different direction, looking specifically at two barriers to effective heritage conservation management. And the first is to do with climate literacy, and whether disaster preparedness can be improved amongst heritage managers through tool sets specifically aimed at improving climate change literacy. And the second is to do with barriers linked to colonial pasts, and by extension, the importance of decolonizing heritage sites. And a really interesting question to me would be how to go about that process. I don't know if we have time to discuss that, but it would be interesting. I think I'm going to use an example actually. In fact, if we move to slide 2, the example I want to use is Tapasa on the coast of Algeria, which is one of the sites that we modelled in our 2022 paper, and which is at quite considerable threat of exposure to extreme seas into the future. So by way of background, next slide, please. Myself and a number of archaeologists and coastal engineers came together in 2022. We mapped African heritage sites and modelled flooding and erosion for different time slices at different degrees of warming over the next 80 years. And we found that even at baseline, as you can see from this image here, many African heritage sites at the coast are already exposed at 2010, which was our baseline. But next slide, please. You can see just what happens at 2100 at 2 degrees of warming. Almost every coastal site in our study will be exposed at some degree to extreme seas causing considerable flooding. Next slide, please. So a key barrier to heritage conservation against climate change is the extent to which heritage managers have climate change literacy and can thereby develop local climate change adaptation plans, or at least have climate change preparedness. So be prepared for the kinds of impacts that might happen in the future. Now, Fatterick and Seekamp, which is this pie graph here, wrote a paper in 2017 about the barriers to effective heritage climate change adaptation. And their study was based on an online survey of heritage experts in the USA. Now, 16 barrier classes were sorted into 3 main categories: institutional barriers, and they're shown in those different shades of gray here, institutional barriers in the darkest gray, technical barriers in the middling gray, and we'll get to the red bit in a minute, the red circle, and financial barriers. Now, even though a lack of climate change knowledge was classed as a technical barrier, many of the institutional barriers were either directly or partially the result of a lack of climate change knowledge. For example, institutional guidelines, prioritization, and centralized policy. Now, there are 3 broad barriers which could have significant consequences for heritage, but could be managed with preemptive conservation measures. And these are conflating weather and climate, which could lead to under or overestimations of heritage vulnerability, understanding the differences between spatial and temporal scales of climate, which could lead to miscalculations on timings and prioritization of heritage conservation interventions, and distinguishing between natural climate variability and human-driven climate change, the latter of which may, in some instances, be quite well managed. Next slide, please. Now, to do with Africa, there is actually some data out there. Simpson et al. 2021 note that climate change literacy in Africa is poorly understood, even though some of the most severe impacts of climate change will be experienced across the continent. Climate change literacy is as low as 12% in Mozambique. Strong predictors education of climate change literacy, education and mobility, and poverty decreases climate change literacy rates for women, and women are on average 12.8% lower than men. Now, World Heritage organizations are investing considerable effort in developing introductory course content and educational packages for heritage climate literacy designed for heritage managers and heritage users. This has already actually taken off in a big way in Britain and in other high-income countries. But I think what we need to do as a barrier to good heritage management going future for climate change is start addressing that in low-income countries. If you could move on, please, to the next slide. Thank you. So the second barrier that I wanted to introduce in the second half of my 10 minutes is decolonizing heritage sites. So this is Tapasa. It's on the coast of Algeria. It's highly exposed to short-term impacts of extreme seas and has already suffered erosion in the past. Next slide, please. Now, the site's main features are, you can see actually there are 2 parts to the site. I'm only using the more western bit of the park in this particular talk, just because I don't really have time to do both. But the main features in the western park are the basilica, which is Byzantine, and the Roman Villa of the Frescoes, which you can see on that slide shown up on the Google Earth image. Now, extreme sea levels at 2100 at 2 degrees of warming will, next slide please, will threaten almost all. So this is the polygon of the Western Park, and you can see, if you look beneath the red line, you can see, if you look carefully, that the flooding. Now this is the 100-year return rate for flooding. I won't go into that, but I'm sure you all know that the 100-year return rate of an extreme event is decreasing year on year at the moment. So so that 100-year doesn't really make any sense at the moment. But you can see that almost all of the basilica and a lot of the Villa of the Frescoes is threatened at 2100 at 2 degrees of warming, which is in fact lower than where we are predicted, where we are heading the pathway at the moment. Now, Tapasa was listed as a World Heritage Site in 1982, and from 2002 to 2006, it was on the list of World Heritage Sites in danger. And both before and since, Algeria has never fully complied with the requests of the World Heritage Committee for a comprehensive management plan. And by 2021, the World Heritage Committee listed the following threats to the site: deliberate destruction of heritage, erosion and siltation deposition, illegal housing, impacts of tourism, poor management activities, marine transport infrastructure, unsuitable restoration techniques, and poor conservation. Now, there was a study undertaken by a team of Algerians who did semi-structured interviews of the town of Tapasa. And despite its recognition as a World Heritage Site, it basically has not... They report that it's not received the government support that it requires. Not only that, there is ambivalence amongst the local population to this site, and I'd argue that this lack of, or this ambivalence is to do with colonial associations. Next slide, please. So the first is that a stele in the memory of Albert Camus was erected at Tapasa in 1961 by his friends after his death at a particularly fraught period in the Algerian War of Independence. And Camus, as some of you may know, was a French-Algerian writer and philosopher. He was born in Algeria, and he was both a supporter of the Arab Algerian population, but also believed wholeheartedly that Algeria was French. He loved Tapasa, where he spent many hours in the ruins in his youth, and this is probably why the stele in his honor was erected. The erection of the stele in 1961 wasn't timely, and a quote on it says, and a part English translation is, "I understand here what is called glory, the right to love beyond measure." Now, although there is no evidence the inscription could have been misconstrued as relating to the Algerian War of Independence, it was written in the full knowledge and experience of the utter brutality that the French inflicted on the indigenous Arab population. Now, secondly, on the right-hand side, you can see that the stele has been removed. I can't independently verify that image, but you can see the plinth on which it stood and a large pile of rubble behind it. And finally, it's impossible now to read Camus' literature in Algeria. His books and pamphlets cannot be purchased anywhere, and the libraries hold none of his work. So it's my contention that despite Tapasa being listed on the World Heritage Site in 1982, changing Algerian identities following the War of Independence has contributed to conflicted negotiations of aspects of the site, which have contributed possibly to the ambivalence and its lack of upkeep. So very much this could be a barrier to do with how conservation of the site could move forward in the future. And so I come back to that question about barriers: is, what do we do in terms of sites like this to move past colonial pasts with heritage sites such as Tapasa? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Jo, for that. And I think they're really insightful observations, not just from the global level, but obviously looking at the site level and some of those cultural obstacles, particularly the remnants of the colonial past and attitudes, which is something that we need to certainly address. Well, what we're going to do is stay with Africa now. We're going to in many ways, the other end of the continent, huge continent, to Hochschild Danji in Zanzibar. So we're really pleased, Hochschild, that you can join us, particularly to share some of your insights in terms of the conservation of a specific building. So looking beyond the sort of the broader strategy and focusing right now on a particular site. So Harshil is a built heritage conservation consultant and former assistant site manager for Stone Town Zanzibar World Heritage Site. Harshil is currently leading climate change research and climate heritage research, training and adaptation works in Zanzibar through the Withstanding Change project implemented by Zanzibar Stone Town Heritage Society. So we're really delighted to have you with us, Harshil. And just to make the point as well, I can't see any questions yet, so feel free, those of you that are participating, obviously, please do type in some questions into the chat and then we'll address those at the end. But for now, let's move to you, Harshil. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Alex. And hello, everyone. Happy to be invited. And I can already see a lot of familiar faces in the list of participants. I have also my team joining in. I can see from the International National Trust Organization. So welcome and thank you for having me. Basically, I will just be speaking as lot has been spoken by the former speakers, Anthony and Joanna. And I will definitely go to like how certainly a single conservation project can provide insights and reflections that can be taken or scaled up to an holistical level. And at the end of the day, we can amend or integrate those findings and the strategies into the existing policies. So with this Withstanding Change Heritage Amongst Climate Uncertainty project, as it is mentioned that it's been implemented by the Zanzibar Stone Town Heritage Society. It's an NGO in collaboration with the International National Trust Organization of the United Kingdom. So we can see how a built conservation project, but at the same time, an international cooperation can give us a brighter future. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, thank you. So basically, what I'll be talking about is how we can take a particular example of a building and then scale it up onto a more holistical point of view. So next slide, please. Yes, for those who are, I think many of them are aware, but for those who are not, the Stone Town of Zanzibar, it's located on the island of Unguja, just off the coast of Tanzania. You can see a little triangular jutting out of the island. So that's where the Stone Town of Zanzibar is. Next slide, please. Yes, now talking about from the heritage perspective and from the World Heritage site, yes, the Stone Town of Zanzibar has been inscribed to the World Heritage List in the year 2000 and under the inscriptions criteria 2, 3, and 6. Mostly I can summarize that as it's an historical settlement, probably as I can say it has emerged as a nature and culture association, which has been further enhanced in the 18th century with, I can say, centuries old of trade between the Zanzibar Islands, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, especially Oman and Yemen, and of course the European influences. So basically that gives the urban structure and the architecture of Stone Town a unique cultural fusion from all these places. So on the right, we can see that's the beautiful map of the conservation area. Most of the buildings, I'm sorry, it's so tiny, but we can see most of the buildings in black and red, blue. There the black is for grade 1 buildings and the bluish is for grade 2 buildings. And we can see how most of them are located on the coastal side. So we then also have the green part, which is the open spaces, and the rest of the buffer zone, which we have it. So one thing that it's necessary to point out is that it is a living heritage city. So that component makes it very unique to it. And currently speaking, I can say 60% of the building stock, it's in a poor condition. Next slide, please. Yes, so when we talk about buildings, the first thing we have to recognize is that buildings are set in a landscape, and we need to go down from an holistical to a particular point. And so we need to understand the holistical risks associated with a particular site. So in case of Stone Town of Zanzibar, of course, as mentioned by speakers, that extreme events are now occurring in a frequencies that we do not anticipate on. For example, there's a photo there that was taken last year in January. That was the effects of the cyclone Cheneso, where we could see that a recently rehabilitated coastal defense is already starting to be overwhelmed with the extreme events. But another particular thing that has been mentioned in the coastal heritage sites is the risk of flooding, and especially I'm talking about the coastal flooding. So one of the data sets that gives us a picture, as we can see on the right, and this is an inundation map we can see. And this scenario is IPCC at 2 degrees of warming, where we can see a most significant part of this Stone Town is going to be underwater by the end of this century. So we can see all these blue marks, that's the part of the land of the Stone Town that's definitely going to be underwater. That's the 2 degrees warming scenario, and I think we are always more than there. And then also there are effects of temperature rises and anomalies. We can see the Stone Town is becoming warmer. And I can say the statistics are showing that the highest maximum temperatures have increased by 1.2%, and the minimum temperatures have already exceeded by 7%. But apart from that precipitation, there is a data set all shows that Stone Town is going to be much wetter with the coming years. So all of this comes in a package, and we can see that also the absolute humidity it's going to rise in the coming years. So all of this combined will surely be affecting, I can say, or impacting our built cultural heritage. Next slide, please. Yes, so talking about going down now to a particular pinpoint, we are going to talk or take a case study of this very exemplary heritage building in Stone Town of Zanzibar, the old customs house. Basically, the building is located on the Mizingani seafront, as you can see on the image on the left. So it's near to the sea. The building was built around 1856, as I mentioned, for the daughter of the Sultan of Zanzibar. And in 1923, the customs authority moved in, and hence it gets its name from the old customs house. And then it has been, the customs authority was there till the 1980s, whereby then the building was, I can say, a squatter and subject to vandalism until 1993, where the building was taken over by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture program, the Historic Supports Program, and a very, I can say, elaborate and restoration was taken to the building. And as we can see the image on the right, that was the condition of the building after restoration in 1999. So what I want to stress out is that for the case study, we are talking about a particular building that was fully restored in just 2 decades ago. So that makes us an ideal, I can say, a best candidate. So all the changes that we have seen to the built fabric or to the building, it's just in last 2 decades. And maybe for clarity, the building is occupied since then by the Zanzibar Stone Town Heritage Society as its office. So it has been under periodic maintenances. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So one of the ways we are going to do an appropriate interventions is we are going to respect the significance of the site. So then we need to understand the particular site. So as I said, the building is of a particular heritage value, and it's a grade 2 building. So we had a beautiful survey work done, taking all the pathologies that are related to the climate hazards. These were informed by laboratory, I can say, analytical results. Of course, experienced judges think well also. So we got all that detailed into a beautiful, I can say, because I'm an architect, so I will present it in in my ways. So next slide, please. Yes. So once all of the information has been collected in a scientific, I can say, or in the technical manner, it is very, very important that we disseminate or we share these experiences or results and findings with the public or with the stakeholders as even. So one of the major component of this project is engaging the community. And when I talk about community here, it's not only the living residents of the Stone Town, who are about 10,000, but also the local government authorities that have the stake in the Stone Town management. But thereafter, the school students, because when we teach them, when they know, when they're informed, when they're younger, it's even more better. So, and then yes, we have a lot of NGOs and state authorities also acting in the Stone Town. So putting them all together, engaging with them and sharing these results, what we found out, how is our heritage being affected? And this is, I think, very essential that we need to understand what values are to those stakeholders, because we as technical or scientific people, we can have our own values, but it doesn't necessarily that we will share them with the community. So we did one mapping. We can see the word cloud there. So what value is held by the community? What do they think about Stone Town or about the heritage? And yes, as we can see, I'm not going into detail, but we can see things popping out like buildings, town, heritage, culture, and most importantly, people. So that is the main, we need to design our interventions on those things so that we can get them abroad. But then we did one exercise with the communities and the stakeholders. So we asked them a very simple question that how would you like we intervene in this climate action or adapting our historic sites to the changing climate? And then we gave them two tags. We gave them green and yellow. Green are for traditional and nature-based solution, and the yellow one is for more engineering technical solutions. And I can see, you can clearly see the results. The green has won. So at the end of the day, it is the traditional knowledge and the nature-based solutions that people want to see. Of course, we had the last two images in the bottom. They show how we engage the students and got their perspective through drawings in addressing the climate solution. Next slide, please.
You've got about a minute left, Hoshel. Okay.
Oh, thank you. So then, of course, in youth engagement, we did this beautiful training in traditional building practices and materials so that we can have the youth better involved into the project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So after all of that works, we did designing the interventions. We implemented the interventions on this particular building. And one thing to note out is that, well, as Anthony mentioned, that conservation can sometimes be challenging when it comes to their principles of, especially in my case with authenticity, where the most authentic material for roofing in Zanzibar is corrugated iron, which is most susceptible to corrosion. So we had to replace this with aluminium. which is a less susceptible material for corrosion, and it's readily available in the market. So it's about just decreasing our carbon footprint and maintain and reducing the embodied carbon. But yes, we can also then see how the traditional knowledge and techniques can be woven into climate action strategies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, we can see that one beautiful example of a conservation project, the findings of it, the vulnerability assessment that has been done can be scaled up to a much wider setting, to the whole historic site. And this is through collaborative. So we need to have all the stakeholders involved so that we can come up with better strategies in addressing this. And we can see that we already in Zanzibar, we have a lot of, I can say, disintegrated policies. We have policies for urban planning, we have policies for environmental management, we have cultural heritage policies. But how we can put them together, we can integrate this and amend them, and we come up something that addresses all of these issues, but keeping in mind that we keep the community involved. Thank you. I know the term does not allow that, but I'm happy to have any questions and discuss this further in our discussion sessions. Thank you. Those are just a list of references. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Arshil, for taking us on that journey right through a single site and then thinking more broadly about the implications. That's really, really useful. Thank you very much indeed. And again, please put some questions in the chat. That'd be great. We'll revisit those, or we will visit those after we've heard from our final speaker, who is Dr. Heather Gill-Frerking, and her educational background is wide and varied. It includes a Bachelor of Education, a PhD in Bioarchaeology, and a Juris Doctor, a law degree that emphasise environmental issues and social justice. She's currently undertaking a second doctorate with a focus on matters of loss and damage of intangible cultural heritage for those experiencing forced climate migration in any form. That's the theme we've visited quite a lot in Coastal Connections. She was just accepted into the EU and Erasmus-funded Heriland Intensive Heritage and Landscape Futures course in Sweden in October. And so we now move from Zanzibar right across to Canada. And again, we see you there, Heather. We're really pleased to have you with us. So over to you. Thanks very much indeed for being here.
Thanks, Alex. Delighted to be here, and it's exciting that I'm going to be able to build on other things that we've already heard this evening. So I want to take you on a different focus to what we've been talking about. I want us to rethink how we're defining and how we're even thinking about what we've traditionally called intangible cultural heritage. I think it's time that we need to move beyond the UNESCO 2003 document that we're all working from. Next slide, please. Before I really get into any detail, I'd like to make formal land acknowledgements. The university at which I study is Carleton University, and Carleton University is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm coming to you from my home office today in the town of Algonquin, Ontario, and my home office is situated on traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, and I'm very grateful that I live and learn on these lands. It's beautiful most of the time. Today it's 30 degrees Celsius and so humid I thought I'd move to Singapore overnight. Next slide, please. So the big question is, why do these alternative meetings matter in law and policy? I'm a bit of a policy wonk. I love policy. I'll read it, I'll dissect it, I'll take it apart, put it back together again. I'm one of those weirdos. And my background in law makes that even more fun. A wonderful piece came out a few years ago by Kuman Turcott, where they looked at culture and its place in talking about heritage. And so they talk about heritage as a social collective to whom the forms have significance. So we're not talking about, tangible or intangible. We're not talking about what exactly is heritage. We're saying it has significance. But they also acknowledge that the relative political power of a given community determines whether and how heritage goods are valued, and that many of the minority groups and Indigenous people with little formal authority in international systems that are dominated by nation states or other groups don't have capacity to protect or even contribute to the protection of their relative and heritage, or even to make claims to their own heritage or protect against claims by others. And so I think it's really important to look at how we're talking about these ideas and these concepts in law and policy, since the people to whom these ideas often belong aren't the people who are writing the policy and the law, and they're often not even at the table when these processes are happening. Next slide, please. So many of us are probably familiar with the UNESCO 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible, and they have the definition that most work from. If you ask people the definition of intangible cultural heritage, and believe me, I have read probably close to 600 papers in the last 6 months, I'm going to say probably 85% of them go to this definition, this idea of practices, representations, expressions, knowledges, skills, instruments, objects, artifacts, cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. Still go back to this concept of cultural heritage, which is undefined. This intangible cultural heritage, and this is what's key, is transmitted from generation to generation, constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, interaction, their nature and history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity. These are important, but I think we need to move away from this definition because I don't think it's fully representing the multiple perspectives of what is heritage. So I'm going to give you a case study in a moment where we'll look at an Indigenous perspective of intangible heritage definition. And I think for me, I regularly work from this 2003 definition, but I've slowly been modifying my definition to include this more natural Indigenous definition. And I've been doing a lot of research in the last few months to find more groups, more Indigenous groups that have their own definitions of intangible cultural heritage, only to discover that there really aren't that many groups that have that. And I've used actually in this case as an example of ICH or intangible cultural heritage, these lovelocks, which have appeared in a number of places. We're very familiar with the bridge in Paris, for example, but there are lots and lots and lots of other locations. That bridge in Paris, the locks got to be such a hazard that they kept cutting them off, and it still wasn't enough that they actually had to remove that type of wall and replace it with another type of wall that didn't allow for the locks to be there because it was such a hazard to the bridge structure as a whole. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you to British Columbia, Canada, which is our westernmost province. We have provinces and territories. So it's our westernmost province. They're highlighted in green. It is a beautiful province. If you ever get the chance to go, you should absolutely go. Stay away from wildfire season. But other than that, it's a fabulously beautiful place. What is also interesting is that this is a province with numerous still existing Indigenous groups. So the map on the right shows you these still existing Indigenous groups in that province. They extend a little bit northward into our Yukon and Northwest Territories. They extend a little bit eastward into Alberta across the Rockies, a little bit southward into places like Seattle in the US, because of course, Indigenous groups don't necessarily follow standard geopolitical boundaries. They follow traditional territorial boundaries. So when you talk about addressing the intangible cultural heritage of a coastline, such as that associated with British Columbia, look at the number of groups that you're dealing with. Okay. These people all have their own perspectives, their own interpretations, their own value systems to bring to the table. And yet we try and address it through one federal policy, or we try and apply one UNESCO 2003 definition to this region. It's not necessarily practical. Next slide, please. So, if I can get the year right, I'm probably going to get it wrong. I believe it was 2019, the BC First Peoples Cultural Council was born. And I have the website for you that Kira will put up for you later. What's interesting about the BC First Peoples Cultural Council is that it's actually a BC Crown Corporation, which means that it is conceived, developed, organized, and run by the British Columbia government. It is funded by the British Columbia government. This particular council, however, has a very large percentage of Indigenous members. They wanted to ensure that they could meet their primary mandate to represent the varied Indigenous groups in the region. And their particular goal, I don't know if the slide is bouncing on your end or if that's just on my end, and so I apologize if there's a technical glitch, but that could just be here. So they drafted their own definition of intangible cultural heritage, and this is the direction to which I have been moving. So for BC First Nations, and First Nations is one of our terms for certain Indigenous groups in our country, First Nations include traditional knowledge, practices, and skills. These are things that define the culture, makes up who they are, right? Language, oral history, art techniques, rituals, stories, and place names. Those make up who we are too. These things may get overlooked as the focus turns to more tangible things that people can see and touch and hold. I know even in my own bioarchaeology background, I'm a specialist in human and animal mummies, and it's a whole lot easier to protect, oddly enough, a vase or an archaeological site than it is to protect a human mummy because of the intangibility that goes with being an ancient human. But that's a discussion for another day. Next slide, please. This definition of intangibility for our Indigenous people in BC goes on to say that the connection that the First Nations have with the land is very much an example of ICH. And they maintain this connection is increasingly difficult. So we are talking about a period of time with incredible climate change, as we've heard from nearly all of our speakers today. In fact, I think all of them. We're all very well aware of this in our field, and anybody who deals with coastal heritage has to be aware of this on a daily basis. It's very difficult and it's very important. This connection to land also includes things like harvesting procedures. When you're looking at a region that is dependent on a salmon run, when you're looking at a region that is dependent upon shellfish or hunts whale or orca or whatever it happens to be, they are dependent on the waters maintaining specific biodiversity. And climate change is making this difficult. So it's affecting their harvesting procedures, the berry spots, the fishing holes, seasonal sites, hunting dens. You need to know where the bear dens are going to be. Bears are a clan totem for several of the groups. And if the bears aren't where they're supposed to be, that makes it very difficult. It also includes things like cultivation practices. Where do you put your fish dams? Where do you put your clam gardens? Where do you make your tree modifications? Well, we're not talking about cultivated agriculture as we would think of it. They still have systematic access to gathered resources. And the other thing that they emphasize as part of their definition that I think we don't emphasize enough in our traditional 2003 definition is that not all intangible cultural heritage can be shared with the general public. In our modern Western world, we make this assumption that we will save and protect the intangible cultural heritage. We will save and protect all cultural heritage. That's our job, right? We want to make sure that we go in and we protect all of this, but we forget that maybe some of it isn't ours to save, right? We aren't the ones that can make the decision of what gets saved or how it gets saved or what gets presented, what can and can't be presented. Some heritage is only acceptable for the eyes of women. Some heritage is only acceptable for the eyes of men, some for elders, whatever the circumstances happen to be, it can't always be shared. And this is something that I think really has to be in a reconsidered definition of intangible cultural heritage. There's secret or sacred knowledge and customs, and secret and sacred knowledge must still be passed on from one generation to the next. And we have to find ways of doing this safely so that the heritage is protected. But we have to consider the documents, the policies, the legislation that we're currently using to do that, because the means that we're currently using aren't allowing that safe, protected knowledge transfer because it's not including the people that need to do the knowledge transfer, whether I'm talking about Canada or New Zealand or the Sami of Norway or many of the African populations. Any place with an Indigenous population has these same issues. Next slide, please.
Got about a minute left, Heather, okay?
Thanks. So as I see it, the problem with our current approaches to intangible heritage policy is that in a lot of cases, ICH is not considered when defining heritage policy at all. We're talking about heritage policy, and intangible cultural heritage is just not even part of the discussion. And when it is, there's a clear lack of a definition, or we resort to the 2003 definition because we don't have anything better to go with. What we're working with are Eurocentric perspectives to the definition, to the interpretation, to the policies. There's often limited or no involvement of Indigenous peoples in drafting policy or in the legislation. They are not part of the discussions, but they may be expected to be a party to, and in fact, they're expected to be happy with the result of the policies that are created, even if they've had no part of it. And we ignore as intangible aspects of things like conflicted and contested heritage, as we were hearing about earlier from Joanne. And I'm thinking about Japanese internment on the west coast of Canada during the World War II, or multicultural communities like Vancouver in Canada, which have huge Asian and Southeast Asian communities that are still part of British colonial communities in that area. Next slide, please. So moving forward, I think we have to revise our binary thinking. It's not just tangible and intangible. It's heritage. Let's make it work together. We have to view heritage as that singular concept. We don't need to separate the physical and the metaphysical. We have to consider alternative and multiple viewpoints on interpretation and definition of heritage, especially if heritage isn't ours to begin with. It's not ours to define. So we have to be careful about that. We have to think more of heritage as future, so how we're moving forward with it, and not just as past or even as present. We have to give much more consideration to the intangible aspects of heritage that provide foundation for value and interpretation for some of the physical. And, this has come up before, but climate change, it's not a buzzword. It's a loathsome reality. It's a day-to-day reality for all of us in what we do, but it's only partially addressed in policy, if at all. And it's not really well done on an international scale. So, it might be done locally, but there isn't enough funding. And that funding has to come from federal governments, and it might have to come from international sources. And they say, well, we can't do this because the policy isn't there or the legislation isn't there. But unless we push for that from a lower level, it'll never happen. And I think it's the final slide, please. So I just really want to advocate for heritage and lawn policy, especially intangible heritage. I'll get off my soapbox soon. And in the face of climate change, heritage protection must be a priority. And spoiler alert, currently it isn't. Recognition of multiple interpretations of intangible heritage is really critical. Again, we have to stop with our Eurocentric perception, and we really need to have clear definitions on what we're writing, and consider what we're writing, and consider the impact of what we're writing and expecting people to adhere to. We need revised definitions. I think possibly it's time to move away from UNESCO 2003. And if so, where do we go? Maybe definitions need to be context specific, but maybe we could look at something like BC has generated. It's not perfect, but it might be a good starting point. And I think that's where I'll stop, because I want to throw that out to everybody else. Thank you.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Heather. That was fantastic. And it's really, really good to see that level of depth of thinking. As you say, you got into this in a lot of detail, but that actually reveals some really useful insights, I think. Now, the thing is, we're obviously a little pressed for time now, but what we're going to do is just put a couple of the questions that have been coming in. There's actually been quite a few questions that are really, really good here. So I'll put a couple of those to the panel. Let's see where we go. So there's a question for Jo here, Joanne. So thank you very much for your informative presentation. It seems community involvement and engagement is paramount in maintenance, preservation of heritage. Are there any efforts you may know of in Algeria to reconnect or redefine the narrative to establish that connection with the local community, perhaps from local heritage groups? We're facing a similar, not as visceral barrier within our community, and I'm hopeful for tips. I wonder, Joanne, if you're able to answer that fairly swiftly. Any efforts you may know?
Yes, hi. So no, actually, I don't know. In fact, that's probably why I brought this to the attention of this group, because it really has fascinated me. As our team, we've been kind of drilling down into the data of individual sites. All we presented was degrees of exposure, percentage of exposure, but we've been drilling down on individual sites, and one of the ones that I'm interested in is Tapasa, and the reasons for why Algeria seems as a nation state, as well as to pass a community to be so ambivalent. Now, I mentioned the community, and that's because there has been this study undertaken by Algerian academics of what interests the Tapasa community most, and the site came in a very poor fourth. And the harbour, the sea, and the surrounding forests all kind of beat the site. But it's bigger than that, because Algeria is opening up now, I think. In fact, just recently I heard that it's really building its tourism. But up until recently, it hasn't had to have tourism. And I think tourism is it's a good and a bad thing for heritage. But countries that need or rely on tourism have, I think, anecdotally, I would say have more interest in their heritage than countries that don't. So Algeria has huge gas and energy reserves, which has enabled it to not have to focus on its heritage sites at all. And I suspect that's also had quite a bit to do with it. It hasn't been interested in having a kind of a tourist element to it. So tourism is something that I think we should be talking about, because it's both good and bad for heritage. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. And I think we have time for one more, although Meredith, I noticed you put your hand up very, very quickly there. Do you want to come in quickly on that response, Meredith, as you're there at lightning speed?
Yeah, I was just going to bring everyone's attention. Maybe it's first and foremost in all of WMF's minds, but WMF has the Watch program. And Joanne, if you and your team, as you're working, if all of you, as you're working at these places, if you're seeing things that are concerning to you, and you want to protect a place, you want to nominate a place to the Watch. This is a program that we have every 2 years, and we had 215 applications this year. But every 2 years, we pick these sites that we advocate for and partners that we want to work with. And so I'd really encourage everyone, if you know of a place and you think what can be done, come and speak to us.
Okay, that's really great to know, actually, because we have been talking about other sites that we are also concerned about. So thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Meredith, for raising that. That's really helpful as well. And it was a very enjoyable week and rigorous week last week. So that's excellent. I'm really aware actually that we're running out of time. I know that there are comments in the chat there, some of them are really, really pertinent ones, and that I know some of our speakers have very kindly addressed some of those, which is fantastic. Just a very quick observation from you, Hoshiel. I wonder if you can respond to this before I hand over to Amy for a minute. If you give a really quick answer to this. So we've got a really interesting observation here that I think this is Lucy Blue. Interesting that your word cloud, Hoshiel, maritime seafaring were not visible, as if the stone town and its buildings were not connected to the sea, which we know is not the case. Is there any sort of reflection that you might have on that, given that these words weren't included so much in the word cloud? Looking from the sea outwards rather than from the sea inwards, maybe? I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good observation that has been made. And when we derived that word cloud, we were shocked as well. But this is what happens when we say these sites are dynamic, and even the living part of it is dynamic. It is very true that there was a time the Stone Town has evolved as a fishing village, but it's no longer is. It's as Ether said, it's a booming tourist destination now. So when tourism comes in, it's good and bad. Something goes out when something comes in. So I think the people have really lost that connection, which we had to feel of the land and the sea. It's like the sea is not providing them any means. So that is something that we have to take into account in our studies. So that would be a quick one, of course.
Yeah, not seen as a sustaining, sort of source for life. That's really interesting. Great. Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. Okay, so what we'll do now, and I want to thank all our speakers again for those fascinating presentations, again, coming from different areas of policy, but also different parts of the world. So thanks again for that. Thanks to all of you that have been asking questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to address all of them. One thing that we need to do now, which is very important for Coastal Connections, is to get an idea of some of the topics that are important to you as participants. And for that, some other questions about who you are as well. For that, I want to hand over to Amy Iwasaki in New York at our headquarters for WMF, and she will then take us through the Mentimeter to allow us to contribute and participate in those
Right.
questionnaires.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to all our speakers for their great presentations. I'm just going to share my screen where I have a Mentimeter poll up and running. So as Alex said, we just want to collect some of your feedback about what sort of topics you're interested in the future. And so I'm going to ask everyone to join this poll. You can do this in one of two ways. The easiest way for most of us is probably to point your camera on your phone at the QR code, and a link should come up to join this poll. And then for those of you who are on a computer, you can just go to www.menti.com and then enter this code at the bottom here, and that should take you to the same waiting room for the poll. So I'll just give you all a few seconds to join and let us know if any of you have any issues.
This is where it gets even more exciting.
The interactive bit, yeah. So, okay. I'm going to move on from the QR code if everyone's on. So the first question that we want to ask is, what best describes your role in relation to coastal heritage? And on your phone or your laptop, you should have a number of options. Please select one that answers the question best. Great, so this is interesting. Definitely majority heritage professionals, split between those who manage a coastal heritage site and those who don't. So this is really helpful to visualize, I think, Alex, as you plan for future workshops.
Indeed.
Okay, now I'll move on to the next question. So we've put up a number of topics, and we're going to ask you to select up to 3 that you're interested in hearing about in future workshops. Great. Nature-based solutions, transforming loss, and risk and site vulnerability to be at the top. Okay. And now I'll move on to the next slide, which is asking you about which climate impacts are you most concerned about? And again, you can choose up to 3 here. So definitely sea level rise seems to be number 1, but we are getting a nice mix. All right, and then last question. With this one, you can just type these into your phone or your computer. So what topics are you interested in exploring in future Coastal Connections workshops? Great. We're definitely seeing community engagement as a big theme, I think.
Yep.
Sustainable tourism, future. I like this. Support for practitioners and researchers dealing with bad news. I think that's something that's so relevant.
It's pretty excellent. It's a good range of things. Brilliant.
This is all really helpful. Thank you.
So,
Great. Maybe that's it then, and I'll turn it back to you, Alex.
brilliant.
Thanks everyone for sharing. This is helpful for us.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks very much indeed, Amy, for running that. And I should say, I think during Watch Week last week, Amy was fantastic in running a lot of the Mentimeter surveys, which are brilliant. And again, I thought it was a no-brainer to do something similar for Coastal Connection. So it's really good to be able to capture some of these ideas, particularly for topics. And I think it's also really important to understand that some of these are recurring topics. So again, we have our themes within Coastal Connections, like, for example, loss, dealing with different types of sustainable engineering solutions, which we have already covered with some of the workshops. And the question was put up in the chat about when will the recordings be available for the previous workshops. And that's something that we hope to get going the next week or so, next couple of weeks. So hopefully by the time we get to, at the very least, the next series of Coastal Connections workshops, then we'll have all of the recordings available, as well as some other resources as well, including the fact sheets for individual sites that we've been working on too. So keep an eye out on the Coastal Connections webpage, and particularly in the resources section at the bottom, to look at those recordings. But anyway, let's turn our thoughts back. Thank you, Amy, for that. Let's turn our thoughts back to today and back to the discussion. So the way that this will work, as always, is that what we will do is break into groups now and then discuss these two questions. Effectively, these are similar questions that we pose all the time, which is about how the speakers have challenged your thinking in terms of how we might approach the conservation of coastal heritage, and then actually thinking a little bit more about the precise implementation of those approaches for your own site, or at least maybe a site that you care for. And maybe to think a little bit about what the obstacles might be to implementing some of those ideas. And again, to get talking about sharing some of those solutions, as well as experiences and expertise within these groups. We've seen from the survey a minute ago that we have a really good number of heritage professionals and also site managers amongst us. So it's great to be able to share some of these ideas and experiences amongst our group. So what we'll have, I know we're running over a little bit. It's been fantastic listening to the speakers and getting your feedback. So I didn't want to cut down on the discussion time. So we've got about 20 minutes to discuss these questions, and then we'll come back in after the breakout groups and have a feedback session in terms of what we've been talking about. Remember that these questions will be posted in the chat of your breakout group, so you don't have to have the memory of a genius to be able to work out what they are. But also bear in mind that we also have the Padlet boards for you to type in some of the notes, some of the main points as well, that come up in those discussions. And I know we're running a little bit behind. If you have to leave, that's perfectly fine. If not, then obviously please feel free to stay and take part in the discussions for however long that is. It's always really useful to get your views. So I think Kira will now split us up into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes, and then we will rejoin in the main session and have a brief roundup. There we go. Kata, do you want to just round off what you were saying there? I know we've been booted back into the main room, but just for the purposes of finishing that last sentence, do you want to just do that, please? If you can unmute. Let's see. There we go.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, just I mean, just to round it up, it's basically the shift of focus on heritage from colonial heritage that it's basically um, now it's been disregarded because the connection with the colonial past, and the kind of the sort of newish heritage of Islamic heritage in Indonesia been brought up, but in the same time there's a kind of this kind of post-colonial ideas going around, and the active involvement of the Netherlands, in this case in Indonesia, into kind of engaging and bringing awareness of the commonality and common heritage. That's kind of what I was going to bring up. There's a common heritage, and probably that's what was about, maybe in a way, in the Algerian case, promoting the commonalities.
Okay, excellent. I have to also just ask Hannah, sorry, Hannah, I know it's just one question. You were talking about a case study. Can you just remind me, where was that place that you mentioned? Again, look at the pre-Islamic heritage. I missed just the beginning of that case study where let me see if I can get you to yeah, there you go.
No, I was just talking about Saudi Arabia. So if you look at the 20-year approach of how Saudi used to approach their heritage and how they're now approaching their heritage, they've done a complete sort of 180 on recognizing the pre-Islamic and promoting and investing in it.
Right. Okay, great. And that's really useful. All right, excellent. So welcome back. I think we can just have a quick round up then. So I wonder if we could do perhaps the other group first. I think maybe there were two groups this time. So if someone from the group that wasn't the one that I was in would want to start first, just tell us some of the key themes that you were talking about, and I'll do the same, and then we can round things up. Anyone want to go ahead with that from group two?
Alex, I'll cover some of that.
Okay, go, Rob.
My screen. We had a continuation, I think, really stemming from Heather's presentation about sort of the really essentially recognizing that current statutes and policy aren't really flexible enough. And I think it was a really neat discussion about how we recognize the fluidity of people, and alongside the fluidity of coastline and the dynamism and change we see along in communities as much we see along the coastline, meant you couldn't sort of make any assumptions about any one fixed thing or aspect of it. And I think that, the trying to homogenize groups as being indigenous groups or coastal communities really sort of oversimplify the complexity of what we're dealing in some cases. So I think that the recognition that if we're looking further and deeper into understanding coastal changes and coastal risks and impacts on heritages, you've got to start back with, what do people think now? Was their understanding of heritage or culture or any other value stem from, and how does that then inform decisions in the future? So it's back to where we really started. It was really thinking about values and significance, and making sure that we, most importantly, listen to what people have to say, and then think how that then shapes the future, and then can keep on listening, because policies and times and situations change, and often not, you have to react in different ways depending on different circumstances.
Okay, excellent. That reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had with Joe the other day, thinking about the importance of engaging and listening to communities, and particularly those at the front line of the coast, and making sure that, again, what is valued is and understood to be valued comes from the communities as well as from other national bodies and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really, really important.
I think we are literally at the front line of this on the Norfolk coast, and not so much heritage, but climate change and the loss of coastline and people's houses falling into the sea. And there has been a real issue between communities and the bodies that make the decisions about what is to be protected and what is not. And it's really demonstrating that changes need to be made, that we can't go on having a kind of a top-down decision-making process.
Yeah. I think that's also a really important aspect of what we were talking about as well. I won't go into everything, but again, in our group, there was a particular observation that, for example, the case study of Algeria was something that had a resonance with Bermuda, for example, in terms of looking at the different or difficult issues in terms of dealing with colonial heritage and understanding that the majority population of Bermuda is now Black. There is heritage pride, but that narrative needs to be written and potentially inspired by the example of British Columbia, where there are people being able now to write their own definitions of what heritage means and what heritage means to them, whether it's intangible or perhaps otherwise. That's a very, very important step, and actually could be a useful way forward in understanding and building some of that narrative. I don't know, Jess, I see that you're here. Do you want to say anything about that to the rest of us? Because that was quite important.
Sure. I just get a little rambly, so I don't really like to jump in. But yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. It kind of struck a chord for, I was saying to the group that it kind of gave me a weird sense of comfort to know that that the issues that I'm dealing with here are not as individual as it seemed. I mean, dealing here is not so visceral as what you were speaking about in Algeria, but there is a general apathy towards heritage here due to a lot of, I mean, we're a British colony. A lot of our heritage is affiliated with British colonization. Our fortifications are incredible, and but there is a lack of connection to the local community here, where they feel that they don't have a story within it. So there is less interest, less community engagement, which means the government is not as interested in it, which obviously means there's no money for restorations and that kind of thing. So it's hard to get that, that interest back up. So I was kind of scrounging for tips of how to get that engagement with the local community and maybe perhaps even rewrite a narrative or get a narrative written that will establish that connection with the local community and therefore find that value for the community within, conserving and the intangible, but also the tangible heritage that we have here, because it is something that is worth saving, something that I very much truly believe in. But obviously, we have to make the connection to local population, because that's what it's for.
Yeah, indeed. I know, Joe, you've got your hand on. Do you want to just...
I do. I want to be controversial. What would happen if a significant heritage site was not valued by a community or at a national level? A site that perhaps, internationally might be seen as something very important, but locally, and this comes back to the kind of colonial thing, and I'm not talking about Tapasa because it's listed, but Tunisia has just Jerba, the island of Jerba, has just come off the tentative list and gone on in 2023 to the World Heritage List. They have probably one of the most important Roman sites. It's famous for it's called Meninx, and it's famous for its purple dye, the trade in the Roman period and later in purple dye. Meninx was not part of their listing. The listing is all post-Arab conquest. Now, and that is interesting. That is interesting, and I can see why, actually, because it's about climate change. Actually, it's about sustainability and adaptation to a very dry environment, and that's the bits that they've listed. But that means that those bits on Jerba will be protected, and they will be able to apply to the World Heritage Fund, etc. Where the Roman site, which is in complete and utter ruin and is at the coast and totally low-lying, is not within that listing group. Now, the interesting thing to me is should anyone worry about that more than Tunisia? Because Tunisia is listed what is important to Tunisia, not what is important internationally. And should we be, how do we, and that comes back to our questions, you know, how are we challenged by that in terms of conservation? I've made everyone shut up.
Well, there we go. That's a cliffhanger, isn't it? To leave it on that. Thank you very much indeed, Jo.
Heather's got a hand up, though.
Yeah. Go for it, Heather. Yeah. You might need to. There we go.
I mean, doesn't that come back to one of those original questions about whether heritage is for the community or for the world, right? Those original questions that were being asked by Renfrew way back when in the decades and so on. Mm. So I sort of whimper because I think, oh, wow, we have to protect that site because I understand the value of the purple. But that's not my decision to make. And I really struggle with when is it my decision to make? And if that, but the problem is the communities are going to change. You know, you have third-party state actors in huge parts of the Middle East right now that will be making decisions about what heritage can and cannot be saved right now, and potentially destroying heritage that can and cannot be saved because they're the ones who are in power right now and make the decisions about what is appropriate heritage to be saved. So it's I don't know. It's a real challenge because if we try to go charging in there as the world, whatever that may be, and say, hey, you have to protect this, it's of world significance.
Colonialism about it again, isn't there?
So exactly.
It's really problematic.
Yeah. And I don't know that there ever will be a good solution for this one. I really don't.
Yeah, indeed. It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Obviously, we've got plenty of time later to talk about this sort of thing. I'm obviously conscious
the OUV. Yeah, exactly. It comes back to the OUV.
Yeah. Potential, I think, for another workshop on this, perhaps. Rob, I realise you've got your hand up. Do you want to say something briefly before we?
You'll have to unmute me.
Yeah, I think you're.
We can hear you. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, the thing is, I'd love to know in the case of Tunisia again. It's a sense of who you actually engage with, because it sounds like there's politics abound and all this sort of thing. You know, a politician may make a statement saying we want to protect a certain type of asset for certain reasons because what it reflects. Have they listened to everyone? And that's the thing, is that we don't know the circumstances there, but it's very much a sense of, you know, as Hannah said, that you know, cultures and policies change. You know, you things happen that you turn views 180 degrees. If Tunisia knows obviously had a large tourism market, Algeria's culture and perception of culture may change again, because if they turn more to wanting to promote tourism and cultural heritage is one of their great assets. So it'll be really interesting to see that, you know, how that sort of dynamic changes people's perspectives as much as sort of the local perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's an excellent point, thinking about how these perceptions obviously change at local, regional, national levels. And again, that multi-scalar side of all of these discussions is something that, again, we probably need to focus on a little bit later. But look, time is really our enemy right now, so I guess we have to bring this one to an end. Thanks very much indeed for staying on and having such a fruitful discussion. I think there's lots of fascinating topics there, particularly one of the key things, again, and this is what we see with Coastal Connections, which is one of the great things, is, again, bringing people together so that they feel they're not alone in facing some of these really difficult challenges. And we see that actually each of our sites that we look at, perhaps, and look after, they're unique, they've got unique significance, but actually some of the challenges are not that different to some of those other places around the world. And sometimes these issues are fairly similar, and we can really learn a lot by sharing how we've overcome those in different parts of the world. So thanks very much indeed. We've put the notes on Padlet. If you want to add any more to those notes, feel free to go to the Padlet board. In our group, I was tapping away and trying to record some things, but feel free if you want to add anything to your own group. So I think we're just about there. The recordings will be up soon, and I just want to say thanks again very much indeed for taking part. We'll have the next set of workshops starting from October, and thanks again for your input in terms of shaping some of those themes. So thanks to all our speakers, thanks to Kira and obviously Josh as well, who've been helping from this end for it all to run smoothly, and for Amy for running the Mentimeter. That was fantastic. And all of you for staying on for the discussion. It was really good. Thanks ever so much. We'll see you.